Davis stepped onto the jet bridge of Flight 427, her suitcase rolling quietly behind her. The airport buzzed with the typical chaos of a Friday afternoon, families rushing to gates, business travelers hurrying through security, and the occasional traveler lost in their phone, oblivious to the crowd around them. Moved with measured grace, her polished heels clicking against the metal walkway. Her son, 8-year-old Jordan, clutched her hand tightly, sensing the subtle tension in his mother's normally calm demeanor. Today, however, there was something in the air, a faint unease she could not quite identify. The flight attendant stationed at the gate, a tall woman in her mid-30s with neatly tied hair and a crisp uniform, glanced up as approached. The look she gave was subtle but sharp, like a hawk sizing up its prey. Noticed it immediately but chose to ignore it, assuming she was overthinking. She had faced judgment before, though not this blatant in such a public setting. Her focus remained on boarding quickly, getting Jordan seated, and settling into the flight before the crowd became overwhelming. As they walked down the narrow aisle, a few passengers glanced at them, some curiously, some with wary expressions. Noticed a middle-aged man whispering to his wife, eyes darting toward her as she passed. It wasn't unusual, people often stared at her because of her race, but today it felt different, sharper, almost anticipatory. She squeezed Jordan's hand, whispering, "It's okay, honey, just ignore them." Jordan nodded silently, trusting his mother's guidance, though his small hand trembled slightly under hers. They approached their row, 14C and 14D, near the middle of the plane. Lifted her bag into the overhead compartment with practiced ease, the smooth motion a comfort in a moment of subtle tension. Jordan climbed into his seat and buckled himself in, his backpack tucked neatly beside him, slid into her seat, smoothing her skirt and taking a deep breath. She had traveled frequently for work. Airports, boarding, and flights were all familiar routines. Yet today, the familiar felt different, as though the air itself had shifted. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the flight attendant's gaze lingering longer than necessary. The attendant's lips pressed into a tight line, brows drawn together in a faint scowl. Turned slightly, offering a polite smile, but the smile was met with a brief, almost imperceptible shake of the head. Other passengers, seated nearby, began to notice the interaction, some exchanging uncertain glances. The cabin's chatter seemed to dim in her perception, replaced by a rising undercurrent of tension. Felt it keenly, an invisible weight pressing down, subtle but unmistakable. Settled into her seat, attempting to focus on Jordan's safety and comfort, but the feeling of scrutiny did not dissipate. She observed the flight attendants preparing the cabin, checking safety equipment and assisting passengers. Everything appeared normal, yet the way the gate attendant's eyes kept returning to her row made uneasy. There was an odd insistence in that gaze, a quiet assertion of control that unsettled her. She told herself to stay calm. She had faced uncomfortable moments before, and new composure was her greatest ally. Minutes passed and the hum of the engines outside began to rise. Passengers continued boarding, some chatting, some absorbed in their devices. Noticed a couple seated a few rows ahead whispering to each other, glancing back in her direction. Jordan tugged gently at her sleeve. "Mom, why are they looking at us like that?" he asked in a small, uncertain voice. Smiled reassuringly, hiding her own growing unease. "Some people are just curious, sweetie. It's okay." "Don't worry about them," she replied softly, attempting to steady both their nerves. As the last of the passengers filed down the aisle, the flight attendant approached. His chest tightened slightly, her instincts warning her that this encounter might escalate. The attendant's posture was formal, professional, but her eyes betrayed an unmistakable judgment. She leaned slightly closer, her voice crisp and pointed. "Excuse me, ma'am. We need to verify your boarding pass and identification before takeoff," she said. Blinked, caught off guard. It was unusual, but she assumed it was standard procedure. "Of course," replied politely, reaching for her identification from her purse. The attendant's hands hovered briefly over the boarding pass, fingers tapping the edge as if calculating or considering something beyond verification. His heart rate increased imperceptibly. Something about the interaction felt unnecessary, uncomfortable. The attendant's expression did not soften, and her tone, while outwardly courteous, carried an undercurrent of condescension. Handed over her documents, noting that other passengers were now watching, some shifting in their seats. She felt exposed, an unwilling center of attention, yet maintained composure. This was, after all, nothing she could not handle, she reminded herself. Minutes stretched uncomfortably as the attendant scrutinized the documents, checking them against an electronic reader. Noticed the slight smirk forming at the corner of the attendant's mouth, subtle but real. A ripple of tension passed through the passengers seated nearby, some glancing toward their phones, others whispering to companions. Jordan fidgeted slightly, sensing his mother's discomfort despite her calm exterior. Thoughts raced. Why was this necessary? Her ticket was valid, her identification impeccable. The rational part of her mind knew there was no cause for concern, yet the emotional impact of the scrutiny left her unsettled. His pulse quickened. She felt the familiar mix of indignation and disbelief creeping in. She had faced microaggressions before, but never in such a direct, public manner. The flight attendant's eyes did not waver, and her posture exuded authority, reinforced by the fact that security personnel were approaching. Realized she was being treated differently, singled out, and yet there was no clear reason. She straightened in her seat, lifting her chin, maintaining dignity while internally bracing for confrontation. As security officers approached, the cabin's atmosphere shifted. Passengers sensed the tension, whispering softly among themselves. Some glanced nervously toward, offering small nods of sympathy. She could feel the weight of judgment, yet she refused to allow it to break her composure. Jordan's small hand clutched hers tightly, seeking reassurance. Smiled briefly, whispering, "Everything will be fine, honey, just stay calm." She exhaled slowly, steadying her breathing. The boarding bridge now felt like a stage, the passengers the audience, and she was the reluctant protagonist in a drama she had not auditioned for. The flight attendant spoke again, her voice carrying authority. "Ma'am, we need to step aside for verification." Nodded politely, though her heart pounded in her chest. As she followed the officers toward the gate, she noticed the whispers spreading among the passengers. Some looked shocked, some sympathetic, some judgmental. Maintained her dignity, walking with a quiet, measured confidence. She knew her composure mattered, not just for her own sake but for Jordan. The plane waited behind her, oblivious to the unfolding drama. And in that moment understood this was only the beginning. Davis walked alongside the security officers, each step heavy with tension she could feel in her chest. Jordan clung tightly to her hand, eyes wide, silently observing the unfolding ordeal. The bright fluorescent lights of the gate area reflected off the polished floors, highlighting every movement, every whisper. Passengers seated near the waiting area had turned toward them, some craning their necks, others whispering hurriedly to companions. His pulse quickened with each step. What had started as routine travel had escalated into a humiliating spectacle she could neither anticipate nor control. The lead officer, a tall man with a square jaw and a neutral expression, gestured toward a side room. "Ma'am, if you'll follow us here, we'll just verify your information," he said, voice professional but firm. Nodded, offering a polite smile, though the edges of her composure trembled. "Of course," she replied. Jordan whispered, "Mom, why are they doing this?" Crouched slightly, bringing herself to his level. "Sometimes people make mistakes, sweetie." "Just stay calm and trust me," she whispered, tightening her grip on his small hand. The flight attendant followed closely, maintaining an air of superiority. Her uniform was immaculate, but her posture suggested arrogance, a self-imposed authority that had no basis beyond the badge she wore. "Ma'am, we need your identification and boarding pass," she repeated, tone clipped. Handed over her documents, noticing the attendant's eyes flicker over them with calculated scrutiny, as if seeking some flaw that did not exist. The subtle insinuation was not lost on. She felt the weight of judgment pressing down, a feeling familiar yet always shocking in its directness. Passengers nearby were now whispering more audibly. "Why are they stopping her?" one woman murmured to her companion. Another man shook his head subtly, glancing at his phone as if to confirm this wasn't some staged misunderstanding. Felt their eyes on her, some sympathetic, others impatient. She held her head high, determined to maintain dignity despite the growing humiliation. Each glance from the flight attendant seemed to punctuate the assumption that had done something wrong, though she knew with certainty she had not. Security officers led Jordan into a small room near the gate, its walls sterile and impersonal. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and a row of chairs lined one wall. Sat, keeping Jordan close beside her, while the officers typed on their laptops, verifying her identification. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally, each minute amplifying the injustice she felt. The flight attendant hovered outside the glass partition, occasionally peeking in, her presence a silent assertion of control. Stomach churned with anger and disbelief. This treatment was unwarranted, unnecessary, and unmistakably biased. "Ma'am, this should only take a few minutes," the lead officer said politely, glancing up from his screen. Nodded curtly, appreciating his professionalism yet feeling the absurdity of her situation. Her mind raced, cataloging every slight, every whisper, every glance. The humiliation was public, performed on an audience of unsuspecting passengers who had no idea how unnecessary it was. Jordan fidgeted beside her, sensing his mother's frustration. Reached over, squeezing his hand gently. "It's okay, baby. Just stay calm," she reassured him, though the tremor in her own voice betrayed the tension simmering beneath her calm exterior. Outside, the cabin continued to fill, unaware of the drama unfolding just beyond the jet bridge. Passengers filed past the gate area, some pausing to glance at her son. She could feel the scrutiny, a silent theater of judgment and curiosity. Her stomach tightened as whispers grew louder. The flight attendant's presence only heightened the tension, a constant reminder that she was being singled out for reasons she could not understand. Straightened, refusing to let humiliation define her. She would remain composed, no matter the injustice. The officers returned after what felt like an eternity, their faces neutral but efficient. "Everything seems to be in order, ma'am," one said, offering a faint, apologetic smile. Exhaled, relief mingling with lingering frustration. She had done nothing wrong, yet the ordeal left an indelible mark on her nerves. As she rose to follow them back toward the gate, the flight attendant stepped closer, blocking the path. Her eyes narrowed, lips pressed tightly together. "Ma'am," she said, voice carrying authority she did not earn, "we just need to ensure you are cleared before boarding." His jaw tightened imperceptibly. "I have already provided all necessary documentation," she said calmly, though every word carried restrained irritation. Jordan glanced up at her, silently absorbing the tension, smiled faintly, a shield of reassurance. She would not allow the flight attendant's arrogance or bias to intimidate her son. Around them, passengers began to murmur more openly. "What's going on?" someone asked quietly. Another nodded, clearly recognizing the unnecessary scrutiny. Humiliation had become a public spectacle, yet she maintained her composure, a quiet defiance growing with each passing second. Finally, the officers gestured for to follow them. The flight attendant, realizing the gate was now populated with witnesses, hesitated. Her confident facade faltered slightly, felt a rush of vindication even before the next turn of events. She walked with measured steps, each stride reinforcing her dignity. Jordan held her hand tightly, mirroring her composed movements. The murmurs of passengers behind them were a subtle chorus of disbelief and support, a reminder that the injustice was visible to others, even if unspoken. As they reached the gate, noticed the automatic door begin to open. A man stepped through, tall, commanding, his uniform crisp, gleaming, a calm authority radiating from him. His heart skipped a beat. Recognition hit immediately. This was her husband, Captain James Davis. Relief and astonishment surged through her simultaneously. The power dynamic shifted instantly, though no words had yet been spoken. The flight attendant's expression faltered, her confidence wavering in the presence of genuine authority. Exhaled, a mix of disbelief and quiet triumph. For a moment everything froze, the tension, the whispers, the subtle power struggle, all suspended as passengers turned to watch the unexpected arrival. Jordan's eyes widened, all replacing worry. Allowed herself a faint smile, squeezing her son's hand. Justice, it seemed, had arrived, not in bureaucracy or procedure, but in the presence of someone whose authority could not be questioned. The confrontation was about to reach its turning point, and its dignity would finally be acknowledged publicly. Davis followed the security officers toward the small waiting area, her heart pounding in her chest. Jordan stayed close by her side, his small hand gripping hers tightly. The fluorescent lights reflected harshly off the polished tile floors, casting long shadows that mirrored her growing sense of isolation. Around them, passengers seated near the gate craned their necks, whispering quietly, their eyes following each step took. Some faces held sympathy, others curiosity, and a few carried subtle judgment. Could feel it all, the weight of the gaze pressing down like an invisible force. The flight attendant hovered nearby, arms crossed, her stance rigid. There was a smug satisfaction in the way she observed, as if every step took confirmed her unwarranted suspicion. Her authority was self-imposed, yet the presence of security officers lent it a dangerous credibility. Stomach churned with indignation. She had done nothing wrong, and yet here she was, scrutinized in front of an audience of strangers. Jordan glanced up at her, wide-eyed, sensing the tension she tried to mask. Bent slightly to meet his gaze. "Stay calm, baby, we'll handle this," she whispered. The officers gestured toward a small, enclosed room near the gate, its walls stark and impersonal. And Jordan entered, and she seated her son beside her, keeping him close. The room felt cold, sterile, and unwelcoming, a temporary holding cell for no reason other than bias. The flight attendant stayed at the doorway, a silent overseer, her eyes flicking from to Jordan and back again. Each glance carried judgment, as though she were silently declaring guilt without evidence. His chest tightened, anger and humiliation mingling with the rising frustration of watching her son witness her being singled out. Reached for her bag, retrieving identification and boarding passes once again. She handed them over to the lead officer, who examined them carefully. Noted the subtle differences in the way her documents were treated compared to other passengers she had observed in previous flights. There was no procedural explanation for the extended scrutiny. The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line, a barely perceptible smirk forming at the corner of her mouth. His composure wavered for just a moment before she tightened her jaw, reminding herself that dignity was her only shield. Time stretched interminably. Each tick of the clock felt, each whisper from nearby passengers louder. Could feel her face heating, her body tense, every instinct screaming at her to confront the injustice, but she did not. Instead, she focused on Jordan, who fidgeted beside her, confused and anxious. "Mom, why is she doing this?" he asked quietly. Looked down, brushing a strand of hair from his face, and whispered, "Some people make mistakes, honey. They're not always fair. But we're calm, and that's what matters." She knew the words were true, but insufficient to shield him from the harshness of public scrutiny. The murmurs outside the room grew. Some passengers whispered among themselves, questioning the need for to be detained. Others leaned forward from their seats, trying to see over the partitions. A quiet tension spread through the waiting area, an invisible undercurrent of discomfort that few dared to name. Felt the weight of their gaze on her shoulders, each one a reminder of the absurdity of the situation. The humiliation was not just private, it was performative, displayed for an audience, a spectacle she had not chosen. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The flight attendant leaned slightly against the wall, observing with a self-satisfied air. Pulse raced. She could feel the judgment not just from the attendant but from the silent authority of the watching passengers. Her dignity felt like a fragile shield, bending but not breaking. Jordan leaned closer, seeking reassurance, placed a hand over his, holding tight. She breathed slowly, reminding herself that she was strong, that composure mattered more than anger in this moment. Finally, the lead officer rose, closing his laptop with a soft click. "Ma'am, it appears everything is in order. You are cleared to proceed," he said, his tone professional yet tinged with apology. Relief surged but could not allow it to overpower the lingering frustration. The flight attendant stepped forward, blocking the path momentarily, her eyes narrowing. "Please remain for a moment. We just need final confirmation," she said. Jaw tightened imperceptibly. She had already provided verification. This pause felt unnecessary, almost deliberate, an attempt to assert power. Passengers outside had begun to notice the interaction. A few murmured quietly, questioning the need for continued scrutiny. Whispers rose. "Why is she being held? She hasn't done anything." A ripple of disapproval spread silently across the gate area. Aware of the audience, straightened her posture. She would not allow the performance of humiliation to define her. She would remain poised, strong, and dignified, even under the weight of public scrutiny. Jordan mirrored her movements, sensing the need to follow her lead. And then, as if the universe had orchestrated timing to perfection, the automatic door to the gate opened. A man stepped through, tall, confident, uniform immaculate, gleaming in the fluorescent light. Captain James Davis moved with calm authority, eyes scanning the room, immediately identifying his wife. His heart leapt. Relief collided with disbelief. The power dynamic shifted instantly. Whispers rose among passengers as they recognized the uniform's significance. The flight attendant's posture faltered. Her confidence, once so assured, began to crumble under the weight of undeniable authority. His jaw relaxed slightly, a small flicker of hope igniting. Jordan's eyes widened, his small hand gripping hers in awe. The presence of her husband, the captain of the very flight she had intended to board, changed everything. The humiliation that had seemed inescapable moments before was suddenly suspended, replaced by a tangible shift in power and expectation. Passengers sensed it immediately. The drama unfolding at the gate had reached a turning point, one that no one present would soon forget. Took a deep breath, standing tall, her dignity renewed. The flight attendant's smirk vanished, replaced by a tension she could no longer hide. Security officers straightened, unsure how to proceed now that the situation had shifted so dramatically. Murmurs filled the waiting area, a chorus of surprise and curiosity. Eyes met her husband across the room, and a wave of relief and quiet triumph washed over her. The confrontation, long and humiliating, was about to take a decisive turn. Davis remained seated in the small gate-side room, her posture rigid despite the tight knot of anxiety coiling in her stomach. Jordan clung to her side, his small hand pressed firmly against hers, a lifeline in an unfamiliar, tense environment. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, the hum echoing in her ears as though amplifying the growing pressure. The room, sterile and impersonal, felt suddenly enormous, stretching with every tick of the clock. Outside, passengers murmured softly, some shifting in their seats, others craning their necks to catch glimpses of what had become an unplanned spectacle. The flight attendant lingered at the doorway, arms crossed, a subtle smirk playing at the corner of her lips. Her gaze alternated between and the seated security officers, as though orchestrating a silent performance of authority. Each glance pressed heavily against composure, an invisible assertion that she was in control. His chest tightened. She had endured scrutiny before, but the mixture of public attention, racial undertones, and bureaucratic rigidity, the humiliation. Her dignity, though intact, felt stretched thin, held taut by patience and self-restraint. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The officers typed away at their laptops, verifying documents, scanning screens, making cursory calls. Every sound, every click echoed unnervingly, focused on Jordan, whose small frame trembled with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Mom, why are they looking at us?" he asked in a quiet, shaky voice, bent slightly to meet his gaze. "Some people make mistakes, honey. Sometimes they act unfairly, but we stay calm, okay?" She whispered, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. Her words, though soothing, could not mask the storm of frustration building within her. Outside, the gate area had grown increasingly aware of the unfolding drama. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, eyebrows raised, some shaking their heads in disbelief. A woman leaned toward her companion, whispering, "Why are they detaining her? She hasn't done anything." Another passenger glanced nervously at his phone, perhaps wondering if someone had documented the interaction online. The subtle chorus of questioning eyes and soft murmurs amplified sense of exposure. Every moment of waiting felt public, a staged humiliation with an invisible audience of strangers. Straightened in her seat, chin lifted, refusing to allow the spectacle to diminish her dignity. Jordan mirrored her posture, his young body stiff with the instinctive need to emulate his mother. She maintained a calm exterior, though internally anger simmered. The flight attendant's presence, the scrutiny of security, and the murmuring audience created a pressure cooker of emotion. Focused on breathing slowly, steadying herself, reminding her son that composure was strength. The irony of the situation was bitter. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, forced to endure suspicion and public judgment. Time dragged, each passing second a reminder of the absurdity she faced. The officers moved efficiently but without urgency, their attention on protocols, not emotions. Watched their fingers tap across keyboards, their faces neutral, eyes occasionally flicking toward the flight attendant for cues. She noted the subtle hierarchy at play, authority enforced, suspicion amplified, dignity challenged. The waiting was deliberate, drawn out, designed to assert control rather than resolve a genuine problem. Thoughts raced. How many others had endured this quietly, unseen, judged unjustly by assumptions and prejudice? Jordan fidgeted, shifting slightly in his chair. "Mom, are we in trouble?" he asked again, a note of genuine fear in his voice. Smiled faintly, squeezing his hand gently. "No, baby, we're fine, everything will be okay. We're together and that's what matters," she whispered, forcing calm into her voice, hoping to instill the same resilience she felt surging inside. Her mind, however, remained alert, aware that patience was a temporary shield. The longer they waited, the more precarious their dignity became. The flight attendant, sensing the prolonged tension, straightened, taking a step closer. She checked her watch subtly, her gaze flicking toward the passengers now clearly observing the interaction. Frustration threatened to boil over, but she clenched her jaw, holding her composure like a shield. Every instinct screamed at her to assert herself, yet she knew that in this moment, restraint was her strongest weapon. She could not afford to give the flight attendant any additional leverage over the situation. Outside the glass partition, murmurs continued to ripple through the waiting area. Some passengers shifted in their seats, leaning forward to catch glimpses of Jordan. A few exchanged subtle looks of support, recognizing the unnecessary scrutiny. The tension in the room was palpable, a quiet crescendo that seemed to stretch time itself. Felt eyes on her, not just from the flight attendant or security, but from the collective audience of strangers whose silent judgment and curiosity intensified the ordeal. And then the moment arrived, a subtle shift that changed the entire energy of the room. The automatic door at the gate opened and a man stepped through. He was tall, his posture commanding, uniform impeccable, gleaming in the fluorescent light. Captain James Davis scanned the room with calm authority, his eyes landing immediately on Jordan. Relief surged through her body, relaxing minutely. She realized that the balance of power, long skewed against her, had suddenly shifted. The waiting game, the public scrutiny, and the unjust humiliation were about to reach a turning point. Passengers immediately noticed the change. Whispers turned to audible murmurs, the tension in the air shifting from anticipation to astonishment. The flight attendant froze, the smug confidence she had carried moments before now evaporating. Security officers straightened, uncertainty creeping into their demeanor as they assessed the arrival of the uniformed man. Exhaled slowly, a wave of relief and disbelief washing over her. Jordan's eyes widened, all replacing fear. In an instant, the ordeal that had felt unending now teetered on the brink of resolution, though the confrontation had not yet begun. His mind raced, cataloging the changes in the room. The flight attendant, once an unchallenged figure of authority, now hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously between the captain and the audience of passengers. The murmurs of astonished onlookers created a subtle chorus that amplified the shift in power dynamics. Felt a small smile tug at the corner of her lips. She had endured the waiting, maintained her composure, and now, Finally, the scales were beginning to tip. Justice, it seemed, had arrived quietly but unmistakably. Took a deep breath, standing tall, her hand tightening briefly around Jordan's. The tension in the room seemed to pulse with anticipation. The flight attendant's eyes narrowed, uncertainty replacing her earlier certainty. Security officers exchanged subtle glances, unsure how to proceed in the presence of someone whose authority could not be questioned. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, whispering and observing, sensing the impending confrontation. Resolve strengthened. The waiting game, long and grueling, had prepared her for this moment. The final act was about to begin. The automatic door swung open, and Captain James Davis stepped through with an authority that immediately commanded attention. Every movement was measured, deliberate, and confident. His crisp uniform gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, the on his shoulders catching the eye of every passenger in the waiting area. A small crowd had formed, drawn by the murmurs and the unusual tension at the gate. As he walked toward the room where and Jordan waited, the air seemed to shift. Conversations quieted. The weight of his presence alone demanded acknowledgement. His pulse quickened, a mixture of relief, disbelief, and anticipation washing over her. She had endured scrutiny, humiliation, and whispers for what felt like an eternity. Now the balance had shifted. She looked at her son, whose eyes were wide with awe and recognition. Jordan's grip on her hand tightened slightly and offered a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "Everything's about to change." She could feel the tension around them begin to shift subtly, as if the room itself recognized the authority of her husband. The flight attendant, once exuding confidence and control, froze. Her smirk vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped uncertainty. She stepped back slightly, her rigid posture faltering. The authority she had wielded so easily moments before now seemed insufficient in the face of someone whose power was absolute within the airline hierarchy. Security officers straightened instinctively, their earlier air of control replaced by cautious deference. Even the murmuring passengers sensed the shift, their whispers of curiosity transforming into a quiet acknowledgement of the dramatic reversal unfolding before them. Captain Davis's eyes swept across the room, scanning the scene with calm precision. He took in the flight attendant's tense posture, the officers' uncertain expressions, and the passengers' hushed reactions. Then his gaze softened slightly as it landed on. Relief, pride, and admiration mingled in her eyes, reflecting the unspoken bond and understanding between them. He walked the final few steps toward her and Jordan, his presence alone creating a protective aura that seemed to shield them from the lingering scrutiny and judgment. He said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Are you all right?" exhaled, a weight lifting slightly from her chest. "Yes," she replied softly. "Thank you for coming." Jordan peeked at his father, his small face lighting up with recognition and wonder. Captain Davis crouched slightly to meet his son's eyes, giving him a reassuring nod. "Everything's fine now, buddy. You're safe," he said gently. The subtle exchange of reassurance amplified the sense of protection and authority that now dominated the space. The flight attendant attempted to assert control once more. "Sir, we were simply verifying." Her words faltered as Captain Davis straightened and fixed her with a steady gaze. "I am the pilot of this flight," he said, voice firm but calm, resonating with undeniable authority. "This is my wife, and she has done nothing wrong." The words carried a weight that immediately shifted the room. The smug confidence the attendant had wielded moments ago crumbled, replaced by nervous uncertainty. Security officers stepped back, glancing at each other, unsure of how to proceed. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, watching the interaction with rapt attention. Whispers grew louder, tinged with astonishment and admiration. The dramatic reversal was clear. The one who had once been scrutinized unfairly was now protected, vindicated by the presence of someone whose authority could not be questioned. Felt a surge of relief and quiet triumph. Her dignity, tested and strained, remained intact, bolstered by her husband's intervention. Jordan's small hand tightened around hers. his sense of wonder mirrored in the eyes of nearby passengers. The flight attendant attempted to regain composure, her voice slightly higher than before. "Sir, we are simply following protocol," Captain Davis interrupted smoothly, his tone calm but final. "Protocol does not justify harassment or unnecessary public humiliation. I expect professionalism and respect toward passengers at all times." His words resonated in the room, echoing authority and expectation. The subtle power dynamics had shifted completely. The once dominant figure of the flight attendant now appeared small, unsure, and exposed before the very public audience of passengers and colleagues alike. Exhaled slowly, feeling the tension that had gripped her for so long begin to dissipate, Jordan leaned closer, his body relaxing slightly under his mother's protective guidance. Captain Davis placed a reassuring hand on shoulder, a quiet gesture of support and affirmation. "You've handled this with grace," he said softly, nodded, acknowledging the strength she had maintained through the ordeal. The room seemed to pulse with a collective recognition. Authority, respect, and dignity had been restored, and the unjust scrutiny that had dominated the earlier moments was now rendered powerless. Passengers continued to observe, some nodding in quiet approval, others whispering amongst themselves about the dramatic turn of events. Security officers, no longer in control, maintained a professional distance, their actions guided by Captain Davis's authority. The flight attendant, visibly shaken, avoided direct eye contact, her earlier confidence replaced by hesitation. His presence, once the subject of unnecessary scrutiny, now commanded empathy and respect from those around her. The humiliation that had seemed endless only moments ago had been disrupted, replaced by vindication and dignity. Captain Davis addressed the flight attendant one final time, his voice calm but unwavering. "This ends now. I expect proper treatment of all passengers without bias or assumption." The statement, simple yet resolute, cemented the shift in authority. Felt a wave of gratitude and relief. She had endured, remained composed, and now justice had been restored in the most immediate and tangible way. Jordan's eyes sparkled with admiration for his father, understanding on some instinctive level the power and protection he embodied. The flight attendant took a subtle step back, clearly humbled, while security officers began to relax, reassured by the captain's intervention. Passengers whispered in quiet disbelief, some nodding in support, others shaking their heads at the unnecessary ordeal. Stood tall, her dignity reinforced, her presence commanding quiet respect. The dramatic pivot had not only vindicated her but also highlighted the absurdity of assumptions, bias, and authority misapplied. The air in the gate area shifted from tension to resolution, a subtle but profound change, palpable to everyone present. Looked at Captain Davis, her eyes conveying gratitude, relief, and admiration. "Thank you," she said softly. He smiled gently, squeezing her shoulder reassuringly. "We'll board now," he said, voice steady, signaling the next step with quiet authority. Jordan clutched his mother's hand, his eyes bright with awe. The once humiliating ordeal had transformed into a moment of vindication and public acknowledgement. Passengers murmured quietly, some taking note, others simply witnessing the resolution of an unfolding drama that had captivated their attention from the start. In that moment, understood the depth of resilience she had shown, the power of composure, and the subtle interplay between authority, bias, and dignity. The captain's presence had disrupted the unfair dynamic, restoring balance in a situation that had seemed entirely beyond control. Jordan's small hand squeezed hers once more, and she returned the gesture, feeling the weight of relief and triumph settle over her. The waiting, the scrutiny, and the humiliation had led to this moment of vindication, public, undeniable, and transformative. Davis exhaled slowly as the tension that had gripped her for so long began to ebb. Captain James Davis stood beside her, a silent pillar of authority, radiating calm and confidence. Jordan, still clutching his mother's hand, looked up at his father with wide eyes, awe mixing with relief. The dramatic intervention had shifted the balance completely. The flight attendant, once smug and unchallenged, now appeared uncertain, her posture rigid but faltering. The subtle tremor in her hands betrayed the realization that she had overstepped, that her assumptions had been exposed in front of a public audience. Passengers nearby whispered among themselves, some exchanging glances of admiration for and Captain Davis, others murmuring about the audacity of the earlier confrontation. Security officers maintained professional composure, though their earlier assertiveness had waned under the captain's clear authority. His chest felt lighter. For the first time since boarding, she allowed herself to relax slightly, though she remained aware of the passengers' eyes. Her dignity had survived scrutiny, public judgment, and a subtle but cruel bias. The ordeal, while humiliating, had been disrupted by truth and authority. Captain Davis's gaze swept across the room, calm but resolute. "This matter ends here," he stated, voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "All passengers deserve respect, and assumptions based on appearances are unacceptable. I expect professionalism and courtesy at all times." The words carried a weight that resonated in the room, silencing murmurs and redirecting attention. The flight attendant, now visibly humbled, stepped back slightly, her eyes avoiding direct contact. Security officers exchanged glances, nodding subtly, acknowledging the finality of the captain's intervention. Felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had endured a public humiliation she had not invited, had faced assumptions and bias, and had maintained composure throughout. Now vindication had arrived. Her dignity, momentarily threatened, stood intact, reinforced by the captain's authority and her own quiet strength. She reached down to squeeze Jordan's hand, offering a small smile. "See, honey, everything's okay now," she whispered softly. Jordan's face lit up, a mixture of pride and relief, as he absorbed the shift from tension to resolution. The flight attendant attempted to regain composure, clearing her throat. "Sir, she began, but Captain Davis raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. His gaze was calm yet unwavering. "There is nothing more to discuss. The passengers are cleared and all protocols have been properly followed. Any further comments should be directed professionally, without judgment or bias." The simplicity of the statement left no room for dispute. Authority and truth aligned, leaving the flight attendant exposed, her earlier display of power rendered ineffective by the captain's intervention. Passengers around the gate murmured quietly, some nodding in quiet approval, others whispering in astonishment at the reversal they had witnessed. A few exchanged glances offering subtle gestures of solidarity. The drama that had unfolded in mere minutes had captured attention and empathy, highlighting both the injustice of assumptions and the strength of resilience. Allowed herself a moment to breathe fully, savoring the relief, and acknowledging the small but powerful victory in maintaining dignity under scrutiny. Captain Davis placed a reassuring hand on shoulder, a gesture both protective and affirming. "You handled this well," he said quietly, a mixture of admiration and pride in his tone. Met his eyes, gratitude reflected in hers. "It wasn't easy," she admitted softly, "but it's over now, thanks to you." The captain nodded, a subtle smile tugging at his lips. The room, once charged with tension, seemed to exhale collectively, as though the very air recognized the resolution and shift in authority. Security officers began to step back, returning to their standard positions, their role in the confrontation effectively concluded. The flight attendant, still visibly shaken, adjusted her uniform and avoided further eye contact with her husband. The subtle power dynamic that had dominated the gate area moments before had been decisively dismantled. Passengers watched quietly, absorbing the lesson embedded in the events. Assumptions, bias, and misuse of authority could be challenged, and dignity could be preserved even under public scrutiny. Glanced at Jordan, who was now visibly more relaxed, the earlier tension replaced by awe and curiosity. "Mom, did Dad just save us?" he asked in a quiet, amazed whisper, smiled, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "We didn't need saving, sweetie. We needed fairness and we got it," she replied softly. Jordan nodded slowly, digesting the lesson in courage, patience, and the subtle power of composure. The emotional impact of the experience, though intense, carried a subtle but profound lesson in resilience and dignity for the young boy. The flight attendant, finally recognizing the finality of the moment, muttered a quiet apology, her voice tentative and uneven. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, ma'am," she said, her eyes flicking briefly nodded slightly, her expression calm and gracious. "Thank you," she replied softly. There was no need for confrontation beyond that. The apology, though brief, acknowledged the earlier misjudgment and closed the chapter on unnecessary scrutiny and bias. The resolution was complete, leaving dignity, fairness, and public acknowledgement intact. Captain Davis adjusted his uniform slightly and glanced around the gate area, ensuring that all passengers were ready for boarding. The murmurs of astonished spectators continued, though now tempered with approval and respect. Exhaled fully, her body relaxing as the tension that had coiled in her chest finally dissipated. The ordeal, while brief, had felt interminable, each moment stretched by scrutiny, judgment, and the invisible audience of onlookers. Now, vindication, authority, and truth had restored balance, and she felt a quiet triumph settle over her. As boarding resumed, passengers began moving toward the aircraft, whispers continuing softly behind them, and Jordan followed Captain Davis, who walked ahead with calm authority. The subtle hum of conversation returned, mingled with occasional murmurs about the unusual incident that had unfolded. The captain's presence and clear authority had not only resolved the immediate conflict, but had also demonstrated the importance of fairness, composure, and dignity in the face of public scrutiny. Felt a profound sense of relief, pride, and quiet triumph as they approached the aircraft. Looked at Captain Davis, gratitude evident in her eyes. "Thank you for standing up," she said quietly. He offered a reassuring smile, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You didn't need me to prove your worth, you did that yourself," he replied. Jordan, holding both his parents' hands, felt the warmth and security of their unity. The ordeal, though intense and emotionally taxing, had ended not with humiliation but with affirmation, teaching a subtle lesson to those who had witnessed it and reinforcing the strength of dignity under pressure. The gate area gradually settled into a quieter rhythm as Captain James Davis led and Jordan backed toward the aircraft. The previous tension lingered subtly in the air, a reminder of the brief but intense confrontation that had unfolded. Passengers who had witnessed the event turned discreet glances toward, some offering small nods of approval or whispered murmurs of support. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as suspicion and humiliation had transformed into a scene of vindication, courage, and authority unmistakably exercised. Could feel the collective acknowledgement, a subtle but profound affirmation of her dignity. Jordan walked beside his mother, wide-eyed and absorbing every nuance of the scene. He noticed the change in passengers' expressions, the shift from curiosity to respect and even subtle admiration. He glanced up at his father, awe shining in his young eyes. "Mom, everyone's looking at you," he whispered, offered a small, reassuring smile, brushing a loose strand of hair from her son's face. "Let them look, baby. What matters is how we hold ourselves, not what others assume," she whispered. Jordan nodded, the lesson of composure under scrutiny settling gently into his consciousness. The flight attendant lingered near the boarding area, visibly humbled, her once authoritative demeanor replaced by caution and unease. Noted the shift without hostility, recognizing the subtle acknowledgement of wrongdoing in the attendant's posture. It was a delicate moment, a quiet lesson in accountability. His composure radiated outward, a subtle but unmistakable declaration that dignity could be preserved even under public scrutiny and unfair treatment. She held her head high, shoulders back, embodying the quiet strength that had carried her through the ordeal. Passengers continued to whisper quietly, some leaning forward to exchange glances with one another. "Did you see that?" one woman murmured to her companion. "She didn't deserve that treatment at all." Another man nodded, adjusting his briefcase as he said softly, "It's good to see someone stand up for her." The murmurs were small, discreet, but could feel them, a subtle wave of empathy and validation washing over her. The public acknowledgement, though understated, reinforced her sense of vindication and relief. Captain Davis maintained a calm, commanding presence, walking slightly ahead to guide them toward the aircraft. His authoritative stride reassured both and Jordan, offering a sense of security that extended beyond the immediate family unit. Passengers continued to observe the family, their gazes a mixture of surprise, approval, and quiet admiration. The one-stance gate area now carried an undercurrent of respect, a testament to the shift in power dynamics and the affirmation of fairness and dignity. Felt the lingering tension fade with each step closer to the plane. As they approached the aircraft, a steward outside offered a polite nod to Captain Davis, recognizing the authority and the resolution of the situation. And Jordan followed closely, the physical proximity to the plane serving as a symbolic transition from humiliation to empowerment. Jordan glanced up at his mother, voice small but earnest. "Mom, did we really just win?" Smiled, tightening her grip on his hand. "We didn't need to win, baby. We just needed to stay true to ourselves. And we did," she replied. Jordan's small nod reflected a growing understanding of the resilience his mother had demonstrated. Passengers who had witnessed the confrontation were now boarding the aircraft in quieter contemplation. Some offered subtle gestures of solidarity, a nod, a small smile toward and her family. The dynamic in the gate area had shifted completely. What had begun as an ordeal of scrutiny and judgment had ended as a public affirmation of dignity and respect. His head lifted slightly higher, shoulders straightened further. She could feel the weight of vindication settling across her back, quiet but undeniable. The flight attendant finally approached, her steps cautious, her voice subdued. "Ma'am, I apologize for the earlier misunderstanding," she said quietly, avoiding direct eye contact with passengers who were watching. Inclined her head slightly, accepting the acknowledgement with grace. "Thank you," she replied softly. The subtle exchange was a public yet discreet acknowledgement of wrongdoing, an essential step in restoring the decorum and fairness that had been disrupted earlier. Passengers noticed, some nodding quietly, their murmurs of approval growing just slightly louder. Captain Davis's presence ensured that the remainder of the boarding process proceeded without incident. Security officers moved aside, allowing passengers to board in a calm and orderly manner. The tension that had dominated the gate area dissipated gradually, replaced by a quieter, more respectful environment. Breathed in deeply, feeling relief, pride, and a quiet sense of triumph settle over her. Jordan skipped slightly beside her, his young mind processing the ordeal and its resolution. The public humiliation had been replaced by vindication, acknowledgement, and emotional closure. As they reached their seats on the plane and Jordan took their places, buckling in with practiced ease, Captain Davis followed shortly after, nodding briefly to the flight attendants as he moved past, ensuring professionalism and order were restored. The cabin, once tense with anticipation of flight, now carried an air of calm. Passengers settled into their routines, whispers replaced by quiet chatter and the familiar sounds of preparation for takeoff. Leaned slightly back in her seat, closing her eyes for a brief moment to savor the resolution, the vindication, and the quiet victory of dignity preserved. Jordan turned to his mother, eyes wide and curious. "Mom, did they all see it?" he asked softly, smiled, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Yes, baby. They all saw that staying calm and standing strong matters more than what anyone else assumes," she whispered. The words, soft but firm, carried a lesson of composure, resilience, and dignity under pressure. Jordan nodded slowly, the quiet understanding of the moment reflecting a subtle but profound lesson in life, witnessed in real time by the passengers surrounding them. Captain Davis gave a brief, reassuring glance toward and Jordan, his presence a constant reminder of authority, fairness, and support. The ordeal, while emotionally intense, had reached a full resolution. Public acknowledgement of the injustice, quiet vindication, and the subtle affirmation of dignity ensured that Jordan could now move forward with both pride and relief. The gate area, once a stage of humiliation, had transformed into a silent testament to the power of composure, integrity, and accountability. Exhaled fully, her body relaxing as she settled into her seat. Jordan nestled closer, the earlier anxiety replaced by comfort and security. Captain Davis checked on them briefly, offering a small smile. "All set?" he asked quietly. Nodded. "Yes, thank you," she replied softly. The cabin hummed gently with the familiar anticipation of flight, and allowed herself a moment to reflect on the journey, both the literal flight ahead and the emotional journey that had brought her to this moment of public vindication and personal triumph. Davis leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly, the tension of the past hour gradually melting away. The cabin hummed with the familiar sounds of engines warming and passengers settling, yet for Jordan, the ordeal they had endured lingered subtly in memory. Jordan's small hand clutched hers, comforted by the reassuring presence of his father beside them. Captain James Davis had returned to his seat with quiet authority, the calm confidence in his demeanor extending a subtle sense of protection over his family. Allowed herself a moment to reflect, savoring the quiet triumph of dignity preserved. The flight attendant, now seated further down the aisle, avoided direct eye contact with but maintained professional decorum. The earlier arrogance and false authority had been replaced by subdued acknowledgement, a silent testament to the consequences of assumptions and bias. His heart swelled slightly, not with anger but with a quiet satisfaction. She had endured public scrutiny, maintained composure, and now, witnessed by passengers and colleagues alike, her dignity stood intact. The lesson of resilience and quiet strength had been proven in real time. Jordan, wide-eyed and curious, leaned toward his mother. "Mom, did everyone see we were right?" he asked softly, smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Yes, baby," she replied quietly. "We stayed calm, we held our heads high, and everyone could see that we were treated unfairly, but we didn't let it break us." Jordan nodded, absorbing the lesson with the quiet wisdom only children often gain from observing their parents' strength. Squeezed his hand gently, a gesture of reassurance and pride. Captain Davis leaned over slightly, catching his eye. "You were incredible," he said quietly. "Your composure kept Jordan calm and you handled yourself with grace." Met his gaze, gratitude reflected in her eyes. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "But having you here made it bearable." Captain Davis nodded, his expression a mixture of pride and affection. The unspoken communication between them spoke volumes. They were a team, resilient and united in the face of adversity. The passengers, many of whom had witnessed the earlier confrontation, settled quietly into their seats. Some exchanged discreet glances, acknowledging the subtle justice that had unfolded in front of them. Whispers of astonishment and approval floated softly through the cabin, a quiet chorus of recognition that dignity had been preserved. It was a rare, understated validation that resonated deeply. What had begun as a public humiliation had evolved into an affirmation, not just of authority, but of character and integrity. Leaned back, reflecting on the ordeal, she thought of the fear and frustration that had gripped her, the whispers of passengers and the unwavering tension in the air. Yet now, she felt a profound sense of closure. The captain's intervention had shifted the power dynamics, corrected an unjust situation, and restored both authority and fairness. She glanced at Jordan, whose small frame radiated relief and curiosity, and she felt a quiet pride in the lesson he had witnessed. Resilience, composure, and dignity under pressure could triumph over bias and assumption. The flight attendant, now silent and subdued, moved quietly through the aisle, performing her duties with professionalism. Noticed the subtle change in demeanor, a tacit acknowledgement that behavior and assumptions carry consequences. She allowed herself a brief, private satisfaction in seeing the subtle, yet meaningful shift. The public vindication was complete, and the lesson had been observed, not through confrontation, but through composure, patience, and authority exercised at the right moment. Captain Davis checked the instruments and began the standard pre-flight procedures, his calm authority resonating throughout the cabin. And Jordan watched quietly, the familiarity of the routines providing a soothing contrast to the earlier chaos. The plane's engines hummed steadily, a reassuring sound that mirrored the steadying of their emotions. Allowed herself to breathe fully, the emotional giving way to quiet reflection. The ordeal, intense and public, had concluded with affirmation and dignity intact, leaving an indelible mark on both mother and son. As the plane taxied toward the runway, glanced at the passengers around her. Some caught her eye, offering subtle smiles or nods of recognition, acknowledging the quiet victory of composure and resilience. Jordan leaned against her side, his small voice whispering, "Mom, we did it," smiled, brushing her hand through his hair. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "We stayed strong, and that made all the difference." The words carried a quiet weight, a reminder of the lesson in integrity, courage, and perseverance under scrutiny. Captain Davis prepared for takeoff, his focus steady, his presence a calm anchor for Jordan. The plane began its ascent smoothly, engines roaring softly, and the cabin filled with the muted hum of passengers adjusting to the motion. Watched through the window as the terminal slowly receded, the cityscape below shrinking into the distance. It was a literal and symbolic departure, a journey away from public scrutiny, from bias, and toward personal vindication and emotional closure. The air of triumph, though subtle, lingered, a testament to resilience and integrity. Allowed herself to relax fully, her body uncoiling from the tension that had gripped it for hours. She looked at Jordan, whose eyes shone with admiration for both his mother and father. "Mom, I hope everyone remembers what happened," he said quietly, smiled, brushing his hair back gently. "They will, baby, but more importantly, we remember what we learned, patience, composure, and standing strong even when it's hard. That's what matters most." Jordan nodded, absorbing the lesson, a quiet understanding settling over him like a gentle tide. Captain Davis glanced at his family, a subtle smile tugging at his lips. "We're clear," he said softly, voice filled with calm authority. Reached over, squeezing his hand in quiet gratitude. The ordeal that had begun with scrutiny and bias had ended in vindication, public acknowledgement, and personal triumph. Jordan nestled closer, comforted by the unity and strength of his parents. The plane climbed steadily, engines humming confidently, carrying with it not just passengers, but a story of dignity preserved, injustice corrected, and lessons learned. Exhaled fully, a small smile spreading across her face. She had endured, she had maintained composure, and she had been publicly vindicated. The moment, though intense and emotionally charged, had concluded with quiet dignity. She glanced at Jordan, then at Captain Davis, and allowed herself to savor the subtle, profound triumph that had been earned through patience, courage, and unwavering composure. The flight continued smoothly, a final chapter in a story of resilience, integrity, and quiet triumph.